Well, it's a pleasure to be here at Belmont, and Belmont has grown to be a place that's quite fond in my heart. The people here, every time we come, just so welcoming, and I feel like there's a real kindred nature with this institution and the work that we're doing. And thank you, Steve, for that beautiful introduction. And it does really feel like there's so much resonance with what is happening here, and especially in light of the larger world that we're living in. And I wanted to take this morning. Well, to begin a little bit with an article written by Christian Wyman in Harper's Magazine, The Tune of Things. And it's one of those articles that you read and resonates so deeply, almost as if he read this thinking of me in mind. And I know that name probably is familiar to many of you. And it was one of those articles that you just kept reading, and he's just, in this very typical fashion, he's just drawing from a wide breadth of his own learning and his own experience, mixing in just the realities of mundane life, but also some of the esoteric philosophies that the academy has struggled with throughout the centuries. And in some ways, it was trying to understand the nature of reality, the nature of consciousness, and moving it from a consciousness that is grounded in the individual, in what is here, to a consciousness that is out there and universal, of which we then participate in. And another way of thinking about that shift is it's a shift from the left brain to the right brain. And he argues that our world, our society, has become so dominated by the left brain thinking that we have lost sight of how we begin to activate that right side and to rightly turn, in the language of Ian McGilchrist, turn the master back to that right brain and activating the left brain of the emissary. And he begins this article with a very familiar experience that many parents can relate to, certainly. And he talks about his daughter, Eliza. And they're walking in the forest, and Eliza looks at a tree and is mesmerized by it. And she's staring into the tree, and she thinks she sees a chameleon or a gecko. I can't remember which one it is. And the parents are watching, and she's just in wonder. And she looks up, and she's staring. She sees a red-headed woodpecker, red-bellied woodpecker, and she's looking and just mesmerized by everything around her. And then he writes about the shift that happens to all children. Eventually, that visionary gleam faded, and as Fannie Howe says, the self replaced the soul as the fist of survival. The self replaced the soul as the fist of survival. He continues, but I remember, and she does too. For a few years, that little golden girl was seeing, quote, into the life of things, as Wordsworth put it, and it was not rare. That she was seeing into the life of things, and it was not rare. And I want to take this morning to think about that transition that we are so familiar with. I don't know if some of us have grown so atrophied in that imagination, where that sense of just living in the mundaneness of our world and being enthralled by it has so left our human experience that we've forgotten that there was ever a time that we actually lived in this life and experienced our perception with that sense of deeper connection, deeper understanding. I remember just a few days ago, my son comes into the room, wakes me and my wife up and says, "Dad, we have to wake up now." And I said, "Why? It's Saturday." He said, "We have to go see the American Kestrel." I mean, who does that in our world? But only children will do that. I mean, fascinated by the American Kestrel. And what has happened such that when we look at this, and all the human faculties that we think about, the one faculty that seems to diminish over time is the imagination. Kids have gobs of it, but we as human adults, in some ways, have very little time, if not patience, for that kind of time and space. And so I want to think about then that shift. And my background, as you heard from Steve, is in the faith and work space. And as I think about that story, that loss of wonder, that loss of imagination, that loss of perception, I think about the largest trends that are happening globally with work. And right now, the latest Gallup poll that annually surveys the state of work, it's called the Annual State of Work, report. That was released just about a week and a half ago. I watch this report every year. And they saw, again, another 2% increase in global disengagement from work. That 80%, I forgot. I have a slide deck here. I'm going to try to move around, and I apologize for that if that's blocking. But 80%, 8 in 10 workers worldwide are not engaged with their work. Okay, now they'll go to define that specifically, but just think about that. The ramifications of that in the past year, $10 trillion lost in productivity. That number is not even comprehensible in my mind. 9% of global GDP consumed by disengagement. And then in all the 10 major regions of the world that they do this survey, 0 regions increased engagement in 2025 as well as in their latest report in 2026. Meaning the trend is sadly being established that the disengagement of what people do for most of their waking hours is only growing in our world. Think about the staggering loss, not of only human economic, the ramifications of that, but the human potential, the creative. What we learned this morning, that we were meant to create, and creativity requires that engagement. And when we think about how this is affecting us psychologically, this is disengagement, a term that I've come to really appreciate that was developed in the early 1920s, I'm sorry, not 1920s, 2020s, not 19, wrong century, by this gentleman called James Cassio, and he was writing for the Institute of the Future. He coined a term called Banny in trying to explain the fact that this older term, VUCA, that was created by the U.S. Army College, seemed no longer appropriate to describe our age. And he came up with this acronym, Banny, to communicate what it feels like to live in our world today, especially as he was writing back in 2020. And Banny stands for our world seems brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. I want to focus on that last word here, incomprehensible, that our complexity outstrips our capacity to process, meaning that our senses can no longer comprehend the reality that we're living in. It doesn't make sense. It just seems so fragmented, and there's too much information that we're drowning in this information, and yet at the same time we are experiencing a profound loss of meaning. And so what starts off in the story of a little girl is also indicative of a larger shift in our society. And how do we begin to understand this shift? What insights might we gain, especially as we look at the scriptures? As a pastor and theologian, I like to think about what worldview are the scriptures presenting to us that helps us understand this Banny world that we're living in. And one of the passages that really intrigued me that I think helps me understand what's happening is this miracle that Jesus does. It's a very peculiar one. In Mark chapter 8, verses 22 to 25, Jesus heals a blind man, but in 2 stages. And what's interesting about this is Jesus certainly, in some ways, had the ability to heal the man outright. But for whatever reasons, he touches his eyes first. And the man can see, but his response when Jesus asks him, "What do you see?" And that question, I think, is also a bit pregnant. The man responds by saying, "I see trees that are walking." Meaning his sight, for those of us who have glasses, when you put your glasses off, like that's what you see, like walking trees, essentially. And the idea being, Jesus needed to touch his eyes once again to see with clarity. And there is in the phrasing of that passage a hearkening back to the Old Testament. One of the phrases that you see is, you'll be a phrase that I want to actually say, bring back to Isaiah 6:9, when Isaiah receives his commission, and God says to Isaiah, "Go and tell this people, be ever hearing, but never understanding, be ever seeing, but never perceiving." Something very similar is said to Jeremiah in this commission. "Hear this, you foolish and senseless people, who have eyes but do not see, who have ears but do not hear. And then one last one to Ezekiel. Son of man, you are living among a rebellious people. They have eyes to see but do not see, and ears to hear but do not hear. Jesus echoes that same passage. And he's hearkening back to the reality of people living in this post-fall exilic context. That we are living in a world where we have eyes but we don't see, that our perception has been significantly diminished. And as we go back and really try to understand what kind of perception are you talking about, we go back to creation and we realize that we were meant to walk with God in the cool of a garden. And if you think about that reality, meaning that our eyes didn't have this bifurcation of seen and unseen, that our human perception was able to understand and sense an invisible God walking with humanity. And so we had this perception that integrated the unseen and the seen together, in which the unseen was the source of those things that are seen, but not only the source, but also is what derives that sense of meaning and integrity. And so this connection of the unseen and seen becomes one of the themes that we see in Scripture of what God is doing in order to bring us back to this place of wholeness. And this, brings me to the work of the arts. When we think about the work of artists, what is at the core of the arts? And a lot of times when I think about the struggles that artists go through, they often will say, does this even matter? Is my work important? Am I just chasing a pipe dream that, goes in the face of so much of what I've heard about what makes someone successful and what makes life important and meaningful? And it's almost like there's a grinding of that sense of what artists perceive inherently. A sensitivity, a perception to reality that you feel like, if I don't get this out, I just feel like I'm going to explode. And in some ways, what defines the artist is, I think, a heightened perception. And that perception often can be described as they see something unseen. They see something that lives in the realm of imagination, and they have to bring it out. They have to create it. And we see there in that impulse the right flow of what brings meaning back into our world, that we've forgotten the underlying invisible or unseen realities that undergird all that is seen. And this matters not just for our own individual sanity, I should say, not society. It matters for our society as a whole, that the proper functioning of our world demands and requires a robust imagination. I'm drawing now, when I say that, from the work of Max Stackhouse. He used to teach at Princeton Seminary. I had the pleasure of learning under him, and I wanted to present something that is a modified version of what he kind of discovered as he was really studying the phenomenon of globalization. And this initial diagram of the anatomy of society is, you can see this in his volume 1 of God and Globalization, but he essentially talks about how every enduring society has 4 foundational spheres. And he said, if you look at sociological studies, again, every enduring society have these particular 4 spheres, but I know there's 5, and I'm going to explain the 5th in a moment. But just to kind of give you a sense, when he looks at every society, obviously you need people, you need families. Families create more people. But families, when they live next to other families, inevitably will argue with one another. They'll have disputes. Usually that comes because of economic agreements that people make, meaning you are a farmer and your neighbor is a hunter, and you say, I'll exchange some wheat if you give me some meat, and we'll both be the better off for it. And in that exchange, you begin to have a more robust economy. But invariably, things happen. Perhaps I can't deliver on the wheat that I promised, and so instead of resorting to violence, which might be our first kind of tendency to resolve things with force, you resolve those things by appealing to a higher authority and form a simple governmental structure. And that authority will say, okay, well, why don't you give him twice the amount of wheat next year? And I say, I can live with that. Okay, that was a joke. It always never really, okay, anyway. So my neighbor doesn't harm me in any way, and I am able to then pay back what I owe without being personally harmed. And so I'm going home, and as I'm going home, I'm singing a song. I'm happy. I live another day. My family gets to survive. And so very naturally, we do this thing we call the arts. And so what Max's contribution was in the study of globalization, as globalization studies were looking at all these other four spheres, his primary contribution and argument is, but if you want to understand how all those four spheres develop in pretty much all of the major civilizations of our world, you have to understand the underlying religion that undergirds the formation of all those primary spheres. That was revolutionary in the studies, globalization studies, to think about the study of religion being more primary and foundational to the study of all the seen aspects of society. And as a theologian, as I looked at this, I realized, but there's something also behind this, even one layer deeper. In the same way that religion fuels the way that we understand all these other spheres, there is something that fuels the development of each of these spheres. There's an unseen reality that gives or animates that sphere so that it can function healthily. That kind of invisible essence can be understood in this way. So the yellow is, in some ways, the animating essence from which that sphere begins to develop in healthy ways. So again, in a family context, families that do not nurture one another do not survive. Okay, I think that's pretty self-evident. Similarly, economic structures that do not provide opportunity for its people, they don't survive, they don't last very long. And history is replete with examples of poor economic structures that do not provide increasing opportunities, and those economic structures that increase opportunities for people tend to flourish. Governmental structures, similarly, if the government does not provide for its people a sense of justice, then that government typically will be toppled. And again, at the heart of the arts is really the imagination. Now that imagination, as you can see, the center sphere of religion, there's kind of a dead orthodoxy, and then at the heart of true religion is worship. And part of what I want to point out in this diagram is the way that these spheres overlap, that one bleeds into the other, so that a family that is growing up in a healthy society is living in one in which opportunities grow because imagination flows into the possibilities, especially in times of disruption. That governments need imagination to figure out, how do we provide this kind of justice for our people? And similarly, the way that imagination and the arts and religion historically have always been so closely tied together, that how do we express our worship in rooms like this, as well as in the kind of art that we see that Joel creates, so that there is this sense of the way that all of this integrates together, and these primary spheres are critical to the development of a healthy society, because as societies develop further, these primary spheres develop secondary spheres and tertiary spheres, and you keep on going on. But I hope that you see, especially those of you who are artists, and the work of the arts in an institution like Belmont, that more than ever, in that loss of that connection between unseen and seen, the imagination plays such a critical role in the health of our society. That your work as an artist is not just about the encouragement of individuals, but goes much more broadly to the health of our society as a whole. I just want to pause there for a second, just for you to kind of appreciate the critical role of the imagination and the arts in the role of a healthy civil society, and to position the work of Belmont and CAC in that larger role, especially given the needs of our particular cultural moment. I have one last, two slides, but I found this slide to be so interesting. This was written by Rudolf Arnheim in 1969, so this is not a recent quote. University of California Press wrote, he was a visual think perceptionist. I think that's one way of saying who Rudolf Arnheim was. The arts are neglected because they are based on perception and perception is disdained because it is not assumed to involve thought. In fact, educators and administrators cannot justify giving the arts an important position in the curriculum unless they understand that the arts are the most powerful means of strengthening the perceptual component without which productive thinking is impossible in every field of academic study. Yeah, let's give that, that's worth like some real... And I think if we begin to understand the implications of this, and again, I think about the work of Ian McGilchrist in trying to understand how do we move our society from one that is dominated by our left brain, right, in the details, in the honing a particular craft and skills, but then we've lost sight of what the right brain does, which is brings together what it's all about, the big picture. How do we allow the flourishing of what you do to impact our society in multiple levels and all the different ways that you as an individual, you as your art, intersects with the different societal spheres that you saw? And what we're going to be doing today are a series of exercises to help us move from that default state for many of us, and I assume a lot of you guys thankfully might be defaulting to the right side of the brain. How do we begin to move that sense of perception from the left to the right brain, from a detail-orientedness to one that is a bit more conceptual in nature, because your imagination is able to bridge that gap between the seen and the unseen, and the way that that gap gets bridged is informed by a faith that says the source of all things is Christ, that Christ is before all things. And that our faith shows us that behind and the connection between the seen and the unseen is really this thing that we call love. And so how do we begin to allow the reality of love to infuse all that we do? Because at the heart and the foundation of all these things is a God who is defined by love. And I want to just end by just reciting this quote from 2 Corinthians 4:18, which is so, I think, apropos to our needs today. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Thank you.